Hi, and welcome to our webinar, Using Assessment Tools Effectively, an overview of 3 tools. My name is Jordan, and thank you for joining us today. A few housekeeping items. We are recording this session and we will send it out afterwards. On your Zoom control panel, please chat to us for any technical difficulties and post questions you may have for the presenters in the Q&A area. Your feedback does inform what we do, so please complete the short survey after this session. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Tisha Paredes for introductions.
All right, thank you, Jordan, and thank you everybody for attending our webinar here. Just a quick agenda and then we'll get started. Here's our plan for today. We're going to go over rubrics and surveys and focus groups. That's what I hope you're here to listen about. And we have 3 different presenters. I will introduce the other 2 presenters and myself once their area comes up. So Sherry will go first with rubrics. We'll have a Q&A after each session. So a short Q&A. So definitely put your questions in the chat. But you also have another opportunity at the end for final Q&As. If you're like me, sometimes you think about questions later on. And so don't worry, you'll have another opportunity to ask questions. Like any good assessment person, we have some session objectives. So here you're going to have a general overview of 3 assessment tools, and then we'll discuss the benefits and then talk about how to utilize those tools. Real quickly, as we get started, there is more to learn from Weave Academy. This is a continuing education, interactive continuing education. And today is September 1st, so this is our webinar. You hopefully see a very important name there, Linda Susty. She does have a curriculum mapping workshop that's coming up, and registration is open for that. You can go to that URL down at the bottom, weaveeducation.com/Weave Academy offerings, or if you have a smartphone, you can scan that little QR code with your smartphone and it'll take you right there. Also, we have 2 courses that are offered, an introduction to assessment course and a next level assessment practices course. And then in between, we have a 4-part workshop series. What's interesting here is that we're going to go over focus groups, surveys, and rubrics very quickly at a high level. If you'd like to know more, there are longer workshops on each one of these topics offered. So go to that website and look at these different things. And if you have any questions, you can contact Sherry for more information. I failed to put Sherry's email in there, so perhaps we can share that with you either in the chat or when we send you the slides and the recording. So without further ado, I mentioned Sherry. I'm going to go ahead and introduce her. Dr. Sherry Popp is currently the Director of Professional Development at Weave Education. And she has over 20 years experience as an educator. And she first served in K-12, and she spent 14 years there as a K-12 teacher, and 8 years serving as an Associate Dean for Assessment and Institutional Effectiveness at a small private college, where she actually was the founding director of the secondary ed program there. She has assisted with numerous institutional accreditation self-studies with the Higher Learning Commission, HLC, for those of you in the know, and the Association for Biblical Higher Education. She's also done programmatic accreditation with the Iowa Board of Education Examiners. She has served as a peer reviewer and a site visitor, and most recently, she received her EDD in Higher Education Leadership from Missouri Baptist University. She also holds an EDS in Educational Administration from there as well. She has been at Weave Education for 2 years, and she has assisted hundreds of institutions in developing high quality and sustainable institutional effectiveness practices. And now she's going to share with us how to design and use rubrics. So Sherry, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Tisha, for the introduction, and thanks to all of you who are joining us. I see people posting from places near and very far away. So thanks for joining our webinar today. So I'm going to start with a definition of what is a rubric, and that might seem like an overly simplistic place to start, but I think it's important in educational effectiveness to build a shared understanding of what we mean when we use various terms. This assessment literacy helps us since everything we do requires collaboration across multiple entities on campus. So a rubric is a teaching and assessment tool designed to clearly describe the characteristics and qualities of a specific learning task. So you might notice that I emphasize the word teaching in that, and that's because of my longtime role as an educator. I see a rubric as a teaching tool as much as an assessment tool. The process of creating the rubric has utility for the instructional design process, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. So another way to describe a rubric is by explaining what question it answers. So a lot of times when we work with institutions and they're starting on their assessment work, we ask them to ask themselves, what problem am I trying to solve, or what questions am I trying to answer? So in this case with assessment, we're asking students to create a product or do some sort of performance task. And the rubric answers the question, by what criteria should this performance be judged? So we'll shift now for a minute, and we're going to talk about the value of using rubrics. And we're going to look from two different perspectives, from the student perspective and then that of the instructor, or if instructor isn't the right role for you and it's assessment professional, whatever role you're in. So first of all, from the student side, if you've spent any time as an educator, you've assigned a task to students and then immediately been asked the question, how long does this need to be? Or some similar kind of question. And I do genuinely think that most students are interested in seeking clarity about what it is that they have to do and at what level they have to do it in order to meet the professor's criteria for what's adequate or good or excellent. So a rubric provides that clarity of expectations. If an assignment is delivered with a well-written rubric, it'll not only tell, but show the qualities and characteristics that are required to achieve the desired outcome or grade or standard. The next thing is that it gives useful feedback. So targeted, specific next steps feedback is proven to increase students' sense of self-efficacy. If they can learn to attribute their successes and their failures to key pieces of knowledge or skills that they either displayed or lacked, then they gain control of their learning. And rubrics are one way we can provide that really consistent, timely next steps feedback to students. And then another goal of ours, excuse me, is to develop student skills in higher order thinking. And a rubric can teach students to analyze and synthesize, especially if it's provided to them before the performance or task is created. And then in addition to that, the reflective thinking that they can do by self-assessing with that rubric when they've completed the task just adds to that. And then a final note is that building the rubric with students, which I highly recommend, can cause them to think critically about the characteristics and the quality of their work. So those are reasons from a student perspective. Let's think for a minute about the instructor's perspective. So you may have at some time encountered an educator, not yourself, I'm sure, who says something like, I just know what an A looks like, or I just know what I'm looking for, or what good writing is. And the problem with that is that you knowing and the students knowing is not the same thing, and you not being able to articulate for them creates instructional problems. So the process of analyzing a task that you're going to assign to students lets you articulate the knowledge and skills needed for them to accomplish that task. You might ask yourself questions like, what goals do I have for this project? Or what will I need to explain or demonstrate? The rubric serves as a map to point to the component parts of that performance. And that then reveals areas of needed instruction. It tells you what you're going to need to explain or demonstrate to them. And a lot of teachers do this in their head naturally. However, the rubric provides a way for you to systematize and articulate that. I do want to acknowledge that all grading is subjective. So this next point says more consistent scoring on purpose. All grading is subjective to some degree, but performance events where we use rubrics tend to be some of the most subjective and the trickiest to score consistently. So a rubric doesn't remove that. It doesn't solve that problem completely, but it does make what is inherently subjective more objective. And then the last point here is about the time saved. And again, I will acknowledge the process of creating a rubric and then calibrating it with scores. Those things are time consuming, but in the end, the well-designed rubric with the articulated qualities and characteristics can be time saving when you're scoring a large number of performance items. So from here, we'll use the remaining time and we'll talk about some considerations for creating quality rubrics. Good rubrics really paint a verbal picture of the expectations for students. So a few things to keep in mind. And the first is linguistic clarity. So if the goal is to create, to articulate the level of quality with clear, concrete, and student-friendly language, is necessary. And this goes further than avoiding negative terms like boring or bad, or even using terms like good, which are nice, but rather vague. So I'd encourage avoiding any of those. But as a specific example, think of an oral presentation where something like fluency is a desired character trait. And so saying something in one of the rubric boxes like speaks poorly is both not descriptive and it's not really helpful to the student because of course they don't desire to speak poorly. So you might convert that language to lacks fluency, which of course is more technically accurate within the discipline, but also not student friendly. So you would consider using language like speaks slowly with hesitation as your descriptor. That's clear, concrete, and understandable by the student. The next thing is focusing on quality and not quantity. So you want to make sure the rubric reflects a focus on both of those things. So if you can imagine a paper where 5 was the desired number of supporting arguments or reasons in a persuasive paper, and a student turns in a paper with 3 reasons, but they're really strong and well-supported reasons. And another student turns in one with 5, but they're really poorly defended and they don't really match the thesis very well. You want to make sure that your rubric accounts for both quality and quantity and gives you the ability to score accurately. The simple scale, it says a 4-point scale here. That's not a hard and fast rule, but 2 general guidelines to keep in mind. If you have an odd number of descriptors, scores tend to gravitate towards the center one. But also having more than 5 levels becomes really cumbersome in the grading process. And it may cause scorers to waste time trying to like dither between what's an 8 and what's a 9. So a simple scale is advised. And finally here, the qualities of manageable length and essential criteria require the rubric designer to balance the competing interests of being thorough, but making the rubric usable. So excessive length may provide more between rater agreement, but it'll be cumbersome in the grading process. If it's too short, you end up burying really essential or important criteria. So choose criteria to reflect on what it is you really want to know. And a suggestion I have is to have portions of your rubric, maybe buckets or themes, where you talk about the quality of thinking, the quantity or quality of content knowledge, and then the organization of the product. A final note on this, if there's a quality that's really difficult for you to define, don't skip it. If it's difficult for you to define and fill in the boxes, just imagine that's probably one of the skills or characteristics that it's most difficult for your students to understand. So a last note here then about how do I create a rubric, just a few practical considerations is if you're creating a new rubric from scratch, of course, consult professional literature and professional organizations. Of course, the AAC and U Value Rubrics are a great resource, but there are also thousands of rubrics available on the web. And if you can imagine any kind of product that you're asking your students to create, someone else has probably done something similar that you can use those rubrics for reference and adapt for your context and your purpose. If you have the benefit of planning a rubric for an assessment that has been used at your institution before, you can also make use of those student samples and work backward to create that rubric. So you would gather the student samples, holistically sort them into levels of quality like good, better, best. And then this is a great place to use Post-it notes and go through and identify the reasons that they are placed in those groups. You can then take those Post-it notes and kind of sort the reasons into clusters and then classify and condense them. And that gives you your categories for your rubric. So that's a process you can use, again, if you have the benefit of having student samples. So I'll just close briefly here with a mention of some resources. They appear on the next page, but among those are the text Classroom Assessment for Student Learning by Chappis, Stiggins, and Arter. And that's originally intended as a K-12 resource, but it really translates well to higher ed. And one of the things it contains is a meta rubric that you can use once you've created your rubric to evaluate the quality of that rubric. So I recommend that. There's a lot of other good tools in there. So hopefully I kept it in my 10 minutes, Tisha, and I think that we are going to take a couple of questions now, if there are any. And if there are some in the chat, maybe Jordan or Tisha, one of you can read them out.
I do not see any at this time, but feel free to send some in now if you would like.
Yeah, please ask the questions. You also have an opportunity at the end. Thank you, Sherry. Yeah, I think rubrics are the duct tape of assessment, and I like this idea of evaluating, using a meta rubric to evaluate your rubric. You said that people could look at or consult other resources, professional organizations, literature. I know you mentioned AAC and U, the Value Rubrics. Are there others that come to mind, accreditation organizations or anything like that?
Yeah, so I'm going to gravitate more to teacher prep because that's my background. And of course, the name of it just went right out of my head, and I've said it a billion times in my life, but the in-task standards provide a rubric for teacher prep. And that's a set of standards as well, but there's also a rubric included in there that talks about levels of quality over the course of the 4 years of training. So that's one that comes to mind. I'll think on that, and if some more pop into my head, or if somebody else thinks of some to put in the chat, that would be great.
There is a question from Ashley. Do you have any recommendations for degree/programmatic assessment that looks at how we build an environment for students to succeed rather than student success on an individual level?
Okay, so I need to hear that question again,
Sure.
or I need to look at it in the chat.
So perhaps also we could circle back to this at the end as well. So I think Ashley's looking for any recommendations that assesses the environment for students to succeed. So is the environment supportive?
Got it.
Is there an infrastructure rather than did this student move forward?
Yeah, and I think what I'll do is I'm going to go back and read that, and then I will either come back and answer live when we get towards the end here, or I'll put an answer in the chat to that.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you. And so there are a couple others, Julie, and one other that we're not going to get to right now, but as the webinar continues, those will be answered at the end. So the next presenter here is Dr. Tansy Vandekar-Burden. And Tansy, as I move forward in my little script here, Tansy is currently the director at the Social Science Research Center at Old Dominion University, and she has been with the SSRC since its inception in 1998. I can't really say 1978, but 1998. So she has more than 20 years experience with survey research, including phone, old school mail surveys. Yes, I have seen Tansy send out those mail surveys and web surveys, as well as conducting focus groups and interviews. She writes grants and serves as she actually writes numerous grants and serves as the project manager or principal investigator for most of those projects at the center. She, of course, works with faculty, staff, and other research partners to support their research and data collection needs. She's taught undergraduate courses in criminal justice and graduate courses in public policy and survey research. She manages survey research and other evaluation activities on a variety of topics, including programs and services for university and community colleges, STEM and cybersecurity topics, and awareness of campus suicide prevention. She also does an infamous survey in our area called something with the quality of life in Hampton Roads. So that's a big survey here. She also currently serves as the chair of the Institutional Review Board, which is helpful when you're trying to ask her about survey projects and research projects that need to get approved. She calls herself a survey nerd, but I have known Tansy for 15 years or so. I call her a data nerd, and lovingly so. And I'll let her begin with her slides. It's all yours, Tansy.
Thank you, Tisha, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Great to see so many people in attendance. Kind of as Sherry pointed out, I think most of you know what a survey is. You've certainly taken surveys, I assume, and or probably created some. I think one of the things to keep in mind when we think about surveys is that often they are used to gather information from a smaller group, a sample, to which we want to then generalize those results back to a bigger population. So if you're looking at trying to assess data, collect data for students as part of your assessment for the institution, you don't necessarily have to survey all, several thousand of your students to make some generalizations about them. However, if you're starting with a very small group of students, maybe just your class, then you might have to survey all of them. And that goes into sampling, which we could spend a lot of time on. We could spend a whole session on sampling, but we'll go ahead and go next to our next description of a survey. And another piece of the survey as a tool is it allows you to provide quantitative or numeric descriptions of data by sampling that smaller group of your whole population. So unlike focus groups, which Tisha will be talking about shortly, this allows people, decision makers, to collect data and then have some numbers tied to them. So 75% of students agreed with this, 25% of students don't understand this. And so there's quantity and numerics described with that. On the slide, you also see, and Tisha alluded to those as well, the different modes of surveys that we can use. Obviously, everything nowadays is pushing to the web. And certainly if you are talking about surveying students, that's probably the best way to get them, is a web-based survey that they can access on their phone. But there are still modes related to doing things face-to-face, mailing, hard copy, and even telephone surveys. So just wanted to point out some of those modes. And you should be thinking about who your target population is, who you're trying to reach with the survey, and what's the best way to reach them. Again, students, probably the best way to reach them is somehow something that they can answer on their phone. Go ahead, next slide. So again, surveys provide us with data and statistics about some aspect of that target population that we're trying to reach. They're achieved through asking standardized sets of questions with forced choice responses, a good old Likert scale, very strongly agree to very strongly disagree, yes, no. Again, these are options that people can choose and then can be quantified once the survey is complete. Again, we're typically, depending on the size of your population, you're only surveying a portion of that target population. Random sampling is the gold standard to be able to achieve results that you can generalize back from your survey results to the whole population. And while As institutions and programs and departments, you have a lot of existing data sources, enrollment data, grades, other kinds of data that you can access. We use surveys when you need information directly from individuals about things that your big data or your existing data sources like enrollment don't necessarily tell you. They're not sufficient to answer the questions that you have. So these may be things like attitudes, perceptions, opinions or preferences, and actual behavior and experiences of students or faculty, employers, alumni, so on and so forth. Next slide. So surveys, again, are one of the tools in the toolbox that you can use to evaluate and assess based on people's opinions, their experiences, and you can use this information to make important decisions, changes to your courses, your programs, policies, and so forth. We've used surveys to help us measure program effectiveness, student learning outcomes, student and employer satisfaction, and experiences of alumni once they leave the institution. So how do we get started? And similar to students in maybe a research methods class, we have to say, well, what's your research question? What's your big question? What do you need to know? And that should probably be related to the goals and objectives of your course, your program, your institution, whatever that may be. And so you focus on your big research question, and then from there you have to conceptualize and operationalize what it is you need to know and what you need to measure. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but thinking about the various dimensions and indicators that will help you answer that research question or that big question. Similar to what Sherry shared about rubrics, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel and start from scratch with creating a survey, starting with a blank piece of paper or blank screen. There are plenty of existing surveys out there to measure various things related to student achievement, student outcomes, various surveys. Some of them are proprietary and cost some money, but there are others out there that are available to use. Colleagues at your institution or other institutions may have done surveys with students, with faculty, and so on. And so getting feedback from them. As we tell our students, do a literature review on what it is you're trying to measure. And that literature review will often turn up sources and good survey questions for you to use. Next slide, please. So thinking about an example, trying to give a concrete example, if we're looking at something to do, if we're trying to assess employer satisfaction with our student interns, students that have worked with employers, been placed with employers, and we want to know how our students are doing. So one of the first things you want to know, and so maybe the question is how satisfied are our employers with our student interns, but what dimensions do we want to measure about that? About their experiences with our students. Perhaps you want to know about some of the work tasks or the activities that were performed by the students, how often they worked, how many students worked there, what kind of hours were required, what is the value of the student and the work that they did to the organization, and what strengths and weaknesses did the students bring to the organization in terms of the skills and the skill sets they brought to the organization. So those are some different dimensions that you can use to help operationalize and conceptualize your survey and what you want to ask. And then what are some of the indicators from those dimensions of employer satisfaction? Obviously, self-reported satisfaction, were you satisfied or how satisfied were you with our students? Does the employer plan to continue to host our student interns? That should be an indicator of their satisfaction with our student program. Would they recommend our students or our internship program to others, to other organizations? And how would they rate our students just in general, but also if it's an employer or an organization that hosts and has a lot of student interns from various institutions in your area, you can ask them to rate your students compared to other students that that they work with. And hopefully, going back to the issue of how do you reach them, hopefully you've got good contact information for them, either by mail, phone, web, to actually deliver the survey to them. Next slide. Something to keep in mind when you're developing a survey is you really need to know something about your target population. And again, that goes back to survey mode and how best to reach them. And so what access to contact information do you have? Do you have phone numbers? Do you have emails? Do you need to go knocking on doors? Can you send something to the mail? And nowadays, we often have to use multiple modes to reach the people that we're trying to reach. Some other things to keep in mind are literacy issues, depending on your target population, the vocabulary and the jargon that you use in a survey of, say, if you were dealing with a bunch of attorneys, you can use legal terms and legal jargon in your survey. But if you are surveying the general public or undergraduate students, that's probably not the type of language you want to consider. Access to technology, the general population, yes, most people are connected to the internet and can access things like a web-based survey, but not everybody. So these are things to keep in mind. Use of incentives can help improve response rates. But again, you need to be careful about that because some populations, professional populations, have ethics about taking incentives. But in most cases, with many things, you want to keep it simple, particularly the survey instrument, the language that you use in your survey questions, and your methodology for reaching people. Okay. So a little bit of how to write good survey questions. And so answering questions with more questions. Again, the jargon and the vocabulary and the literacy issues are all something to keep in mind. We did a national survey, one of our very first telephone surveys we did for the center 20 plus years ago. And we were doing a survey about driving behavior, and people did not understand the word urban, or they wanted us to define when we asked a question about driving on urban roads. And so that's kind of been my measuring stick, you know, in terms of vocabulary for dealing with populations like the general public. Another common mistake is asking more than one question in a question. So if you want to ask if the financial aid services offered at your institution are timely and accessible, don't put that in one question, because if they are timely but not accessible, then I don't know how to answer that question. You want to have options to the survey question that match the question task. So if you're asking about satisfaction, make sure your scale and the response options asking satisfaction and not frequency or something like that. Does the survey flow well? You want to organize your survey questions around your dimensions and your indicators. So if you've got questions about student performance, put those together. Questions about student skills, strengths and weaknesses, put those together. Keep your questions that are redundant and similar. You want to keep the survey as short as possible. And always ask yourself, is this question going to help me answer our big research question, our big question that we have in general? And are there questions that might be missing that we need to ask? Next slide. And so here are some suggested readings. The Fowler is a very basic kind of survey primer that I've used in my intro to survey research class. Anything by Don Dillman is going to be first rate. He is a quintessential expert in terms of methodology around designing surveys for different modes. And the Psychology of Survey Response, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of how ordering of questions might influence subsequent questions and responses. So those are just some suggested readings there for the group.
All right, thank you, Tansy. And I happen to have that Creswell book and Power book as well. So they are great resources. There was one question that I saw pop up early on, which is one of my favorite questions. What are good strategies to boost survey response rates?
That's the key question everyone wants to know, right? So the research shows that if you can provide an incentive upfront to everybody that you ask to do the survey, that will help improve your response rate. So if you are doing, for example, years ago, we did a survey, a mail survey, and we put a $1 bill in every envelope to probably over 2,000 people in the state of New Hampshire that we were sending the survey to. Now that causes a lot of anxiety and stress and auditing points, but the research does show that if people are given an incentive upfront, that helps improve response rate. The other thing quickly that I can suggest is you've got to meet them where they are. And so you might only have email addresses, but if there's a way that you can follow that up with somehow sending something through the mail, phone calls, and also multiple attempts. Don't just send one email invitation and expect people are going to answer. The more contacts, the more touch points you have with trying to improve your response rate, you will, each time you send out invitation, make phone calls, send letters, you're going to get some response back. So those are a couple of quick ones right there.
Okay, thank you. There's some more in the Q&A, not in the chat, but in the Q&A that you might want to type or respond to directly. But here's an interesting one that I'm sure a lot of us have. Do survey responses have value if you don't meet a response rate threshold?
So there's been a lot of talk about this, particularly when it comes to telephone surveys, which used to kind of be the gold standard before the advent of the cell phone. And the research is mixed, but I think some of the more recent studies that I've seen show that response rate shouldn't be the be all end all for grading or assessing the quality of the survey responses. One of the things to look at is, even if your response rate is low or lower than you want it to be, who do your respondents look like? Do they look like that target population? So, you know, if you're dealing with a population that is, you know, 75% male, 25% female, but your responses are 60% female and 40% male, then obviously, you know, there's some issues there. So, response rate is one indicator, but it's not the only indicator. And I think you need to include questions in your survey so that you can assess who did you hear from and do they look like the group as a whole that you were trying to reach.
Thank you, Tansy. I know that's always a popular question. I can remember one survey, not sure if you were involved with, but we had a 3% response rate. And one of the questions, the response was 98% of the students get a job after 6 months after graduating college. Well, it was 98% of those 3%.
Yes.
So it's interesting how you can shade it, how you can talk about data in different ways. But thank you, Tansy. There's more questions in the Q&A if you want to take some time, like Sherry, to type out some responses so everybody can see them. It is now my turn, and I'm here to talk about designing and using focus groups. I am now with Weave part-time. However, in June, as recently as in June, I stepped down from my position as Assistant Vice President for Old Dominion University. I oversaw institutional effectiveness and assessment. I was there for almost 20 years, hence the number 18 back here, if you can see it on my screen. When I was there, I oversaw assessment of general education, academic and administrative assessment, strategic planning assessment. We also oversaw the accreditation activities, the specialized and regional accreditation activities for the institution, faculty credentialing. We did a lot of different things, but right now what I do is I help do these webinars for Weave and other courses for Weave, but I also consult with other institutions and help them. So that's a little bit about me. There is a reference list later on. Once you get these slides, you'll see it, where a lot of this information comes out of a book that myself and 2 other colleagues wrote. And so if you're interested in focus groups, you can, there's a bunch of resources on them. You can look at that, or you can also attend the webinar later on, or the workshop later on this semester. But Morgan really has this interesting, this is the first definition I saw. I was actually in graduate school when I saw this definition of what is a focus group. And she talks about this lively conversation amongst friends or neighbors. And I thought that was a really interesting description. And that is what you want a focus group to be. You want it to be, you want to create an environment where it creates this lively conversation. Now, for the purposes of your institution and this webinar as well, we need a little bit more concrete definition. And this comes from the book that I was referencing earlier, but it's a group discussion with trained and skilled moderators. That's very, very important. You just don't show up and start asking questions. They're trained and they're skilled moderators that use open-ended questions to promote interaction. and explore participants' perspectives and experiences. So that's very, very important here. Questions that promote interaction and exploration. It's in a structured but relaxed atmosphere. Remember, we still want that lively conversation amongst neighbors, but it has to be structured in a way. Remember, we want focus groups to be as rigorous and relevant as, say, as surveys. In surveys, you may say reliable and valid. In focus groups, you talk about rigorous and relevancy. And so that's really important because a lot of people may not think focus groups are as rigorous and relevant or reliable and valid as surveys, but if you have them in a structured environment, they can be. Now, why would I use them? Well, why not? Like rubrics, they're the duct tape of assessment, but they are a lot of work. So you should use them in certain situations. And I think this is very important to understand. And Tansy talked a lot about this. You know, you construct a survey and you've got this quantitative data, right? You've got a Likert scale, you've got percentages, and universities are awash in quantitative data. We count everything. We have retention rates, we have attrition rates, we have grades, we have everything, right? We even have surveys about sense of belonging and experiences and all of this kind of stuff. But we're not always sure what those numbers mean. And focus groups answer that elusive why. Why are the numbers like this? What do the numbers mean? And I love this quote here from Cameron, that not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So think about that when you're thinking about focus groups and why you would use them. Because sometimes you need to dig a little bit deeper and answer that elusive why. And you can't always count that why with a Likert scale. So why would I use focus groups? This is interesting. And these three ways of using focus groups is very interesting. For the most part, I've done the first one. I have done the other two as well. But for the most part, people use focus groups as a sole source of gathering information, right? So they want to know about how participants make meaning about a topic or interest. What are their perceptions? What are their experiences? That's usually why we do focus groups. But these other two sometimes are often or sometimes are overlooked. And both Tansy and I have worked on projects where we've used these other two. Sometimes you can use a focus group to construct a survey. Okay, so you don't quite know where to begin, maybe with survey design or survey questions. So you do a focus group and narrow down the areas that you want to focus on for your survey. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes you get your survey results back and you're like, what the heck does that mean? Why? Why did respondents answer this way? What is the meaning behind these numbers? And so you do the focus group to explore your survey results a little more deeply. So these are three interesting ways that you can use focus groups, and all are pretty informative. You just have to think about your project and what you want to know. Here's some examples here of different focus groups. So we have done it to gain employer feedback, which is very, very interesting about our students. Another one is if you're thinking about a strategic plan for the university. Usually we talk about surveys, but sometimes you can do focus groups to dig deeper and really get at the meaning behind some of those numbers. And you can see here too, we've used it for accreditation stuff. We've used it for quality of university life, work-life balance. So many, many different things that you can use focus groups for, just like surveys, but you get a little bit different information. So I'm going to switch a little bit here and talk about how to conduct a focus group. 6 easy steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, done. I wish it was that simple. It isn't that simple. I do not have time to explore all 6 of these steps. Later on, there'll be a workshop, I believe in the fall, later fall, November, that I'll actually go over all 6 of these steps. But for now, I'm only going to focus on step 1 and step 6, because those are the 2 that I get the most questions about. And actually, Tansy already went over how to talk about your research questions or how to write your research questions. And a lot of people forget about this when they're doing focus groups. Typically, you get that phone call and it's from the president or the provost or the vice president, and they say, hey, I want to know about X, or the director of career services wants to know about Y. And then you just are off and running. Well, again, to make focus groups relevant and rigorous, you want to make sure that you have good research questions. And remember what Tansy said, they're aligned with your project goals and outcomes, those kinds of things. There's a clearly stated purpose and so forth. So then from there, once you have your focus group questions, once you have your research questions, then you align your focus group questions with your research questions. And here's some tips and tricks on how to write good focus group questions. You want to, again, make sure that you're not using murky language, right? There's only one interpretation, like Tansy's example about urban. You want to use clear, unambiguous language. Just like with surveys, during focus groups, you don't define the terms for the participants. They're the ones that tell you how they define the terms. And you want to ask open-ended questions. Survey questions are more close-ended, where you can answer a Likert scale. You have a yes, no. Focus group questions are typically broader, where it elicits conversation and you have people think back or reflect on their experiences or perceptions. What you don't want to do is ask why. I know focus groups answer that elusive why question, but you don't want to ask it during the focus group. That's too broad of a question. What you would actually say is, please elaborate more on your experiences, or tell me about your experiences, or something like that. So you don't want to use that why, although it's easy to lean on that why. Do not ask leading questions or use them sparingly. And I always joke about this because I go back and forth with this. Sometimes you do want to know about the positive experiences that somebody had. But if you open with that, oh, tell me about all the positive experiences you had during this webinar, that's a leading question, just like with surveys. So I may say, tell me about your experiences in the webinar. And then I may follow up with, well, tell me about the positive ones, tell me about the negative ones, something like that. So be careful in how you lead the participant to a response. And Tansy also covered this using double-barreled questions. This is a great example. This is a real example. Who do you ask for advice about life and help with classes? Well, I may ask my parents about advice about life, and I may ask my roommate about class help. So don't use double-barreled questions, although it's easy to get caught up in that, much like surveys. Here's some samples on focus group questions, some example focus group questions that can get you started. And you can see how these are open-ended and broad. Have you been involved? How have you been involved with this program or career services or something like that? Tell me about the experiences you've had with, or tell me about the experiences you've had during your time at X university or something like that. You can see this could be used for faculty, staff, or students. This could be used in different ways. When I say, what comes to mind? This is a very common one. So when I say assessment, what comes to mind? Try that out on your campus and see what kind of questions, what kind of responses you get. What impact did X have on Y? So again, you can kind of see here how focus group questions are different than survey questions, right? They're all open-ended, they're a little bit more broad, but they're still structured and guide the respondent down a path. It's not this big open-ended why question. All right, switching gears real quick to analyzing the data, because this is another question that I get. And again, there's more steps in between. There's how you conduct a focus group, how you train and select the moderators, but how you analyze data is very, very important here. And there are tons of books on just analyzing data. Now, I know there's software out there. There's In Vivo, there's some other software as well. Frankly, I'm a little old school. I like my highlighters and colored pencils, but any way you do it, you still have to follow these tenets. you still have to look for similar themes or topics. You have to group similar themes or topics, okay? You still have to look for that in your data, which does mean reading a transcript or something like that, listening to the audio recording, even if you don't transcribe your focus group responses verbatim, you do have to listen to the audio recording and group together similar topics or themes. Really thinking about what the participants meant is interesting here because you have to contextualize their responses. So if I say, you know, if I ask about, tell me your experiences this semester, at the start of the semester at your university, something like that. And somebody talks about how their experiences are terrible because their office is near the football field and they can't park. Well, if I didn't contextualize that, I may analyze the data and may have some negative responses that maybe are out of context. It's related to parking and football. It's not related to overall experiences at X university. So just think about that as well. And I love a nonverbal. As you can see, I use my hands a lot to talk, and I usually nod my head. Participants do this as well. They nod their heads without saying something. Sometimes somebody will respond and participants will nod their head in agreement. You want to write that down. You want to use that in your data analysis. Most participants nodded their head in affirmation. Or some participants had a look of confusion and didn't understand. You know, those are the things that you need to take down that are not captured in the audio recording. Very rarely do we video record focus groups. That's a whole nother layer, but typically you do audio record. And then the other piece of that is the intensity of the comment. So, you know, I've had people pound on the table, you know, this has to be fixed. This is my experience. And they are very intense with their comment, and other people are intense with either their head nods or they're emphatic with their head nods or something like that. So that's something you need to capture in the data. The frequency and the extensiveness of a topic or theme should also be paid attention to. If you've got a one-off comment here about how parking is bad, but nobody else talked about parking, or at least nobody talked about it in a negative way, then you really shouldn't be able to bring in that negative comment about parking, because that's not similar to other things. So think about how many times something is said, how many times it's repeated, and the extensiveness of that topic. And that's how you really group together similar themes or topics. And then lastly, kind of aligning with the first bullet as well, you want to think about big ideas. So maybe one big idea is students rely on peers for academic success. And then underneath there, you have some bullet points of maybe some comments or how they rely on peers. They ask them about classes. They ask them what resources to go to on campus. They ask them which faculty are the best faculty to take a class from. So that's how you organize big ideas under that. That was a real quick overview of focus groups. And there are some suggested readings here. That Creswell is also one that Tansy suggested. I actually think that's a great book. That's a great book for any practitioner in the field to have. That's the 4th edition. I actually think now they have the 5th edition, and then some other books as well. I do see that, Lori, you typed in a message about what's a good size for one group and a good number of groups to represent students. Well, I'm going to give you an answer that everybody hates. It depends. And Tansy might smile at this. I say 7 to 10 participants. Some people say 8 to 12 participants. So that's a normal size for focus groups. We try not to go below 5 because it gets really, really small. We typically suggest 2 moderators per focus group. Now, having said that, you just typically don't do 1 focus group, right? Because if you only have 1 of 7 participants, you may not be able to generalize the data. So perhaps you're doing 3 or 4 focus groups of 7. of students. Maybe you want to talk to first-year students versus senior students. So now you've got 3 to 4 to 5 focus groups of 7 to 10 of first-year students, 3 to 4 to 5 focus groups of 7 to 10 seniors. See how this could get large really quickly? So that's also something you have to think about with focus groups, that it does take a lot more time. It does take some resources. And when I say resources, I mean money, because you typically have to have incentives to bring people in, which is usually food or some sort of prize drawing. But much like surveys, that you still get good information from it. It just takes time. Surveys are usually a little more economical, except when you get into incentives. So that's hopefully answers your question. I forgot who said that, but hopefully it answers your question. Are there any more questions for the good of the group? And Tansy and Sherry will come back in.
I'm going to take a stab for a minute. I'm going to make a comment that might address a couple of the questions about the rubrics that came up in there. And so Tisha made this really great comment about rubrics being the duct tape of assessment, but also it's important to remember they're not the Swiss Army knife of assessment. So they don't solve every question that you're trying to answer. So there were some questions in there about how can we tell if our program has created an environment for student success? I'm not sure that a rubric can help you get at that, because you're not evaluating a performance of students. You're trying to evaluate the work that you've done to create a curriculum and a program for your students. And there may be rubrics out there that do that, but it's not in the same vein as kind of what we were thinking about. So one of the other questions then said holistic or analytic. And so again, it depends. What question are you trying to answer, and what are you going to do with the data that you collect? If you're assessing students at the end of their sophomore year on a performance that they have to then master and perfect by the end of their program, then you need a rubric that will help you and help them know how to improve on the component parts of that task. So a holistic rubric wouldn't probably do much to that end. So it's not analytic versus holistic. It's choose the type that's going to give you useful data for what it is that you're trying to understand about your students' progress. So I think I hit on a couple there, and then I'll let the others of you try and field some of the other questions. And I did get I was gonna say I got the engineering one in the Q&A, although I'm not an engineer. So if someone else has wiser words, they should share them.
I this inter-rater reliability, we use a lot of rubrics. We actually have a 2 to 3 hour calibration session with faculty. Sherry, I see you nodding your head, so that would help mitigate inter-rater reliability. I'm just going to move on to surveys. It looks like Tansy answered most of the survey questions. Tansy was on it. I don't know if there's any more questions for Tansy. And then focus groups, only one here. So I think that was answered as well. Hope everybody got their questions answered. I'm sorry if we did not get to you. Jordan, are there any final thoughts that you'd like to impart to the group?
Thanks, Tisha. And it looks like all questions that came through chat and Q&A were answered. So thank you, presenters. I think that may be a first in the history. As far as other upcoming events, there was a question. A recording will be provided in a follow-up email. That email will also contain a link to begin registering for the curriculum mapping workshop with Linda Susky. So you can expect that tomorrow if that is something that you would like to keep an eye out for.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. And again, visit the We Acknowledge Center. There's the QR code there, but also on the other slides, here's the URL at the bottom. Please look at our other workshops and offerings, but there's also white papers. There's a wealth of material in the Knowledge So thank you, everyone. And I think we have given you the gift of time of 1 minute.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see all of you.